name is Jonathan CARRIEL. I'm the author of the Thomas Dordrecht Historical Mystery Series, and I have a bachelor's and master's in history from New York University. Came up with the idea of a series based around a single individual who was born in a specific year, who had adventures in each specific year. A New Yorker. I wanted to get the perspective of New Yorkers on the Revolutionary period, and I wanted to get the commercial perspective as opposed to the political or the military perspective. So I made my hero is going to be a businessman, particularly a shipper. Also, he has a great travel lust and a great desire to experience the world and see everything and meet people and so forth, which I think is very endearing in a character. So we come to the current book, which is Exquisite Folly. It takes its name from an aphorism of Franklin's in the Poor Richard's Almanac. The most exquisite folly is made of wisdom spun too fine. Wisdom spun too fine was a good phrase for what the British government was about when it created the Stamp Act. What impressed me on studying the background of the creation of the Stamp Act was that the British, Grenville particularly, Lord Grenville, who was the Prime Minister, the Whig Prime Minister, really believed he had the perfect way of asking Americans to pay taxes to defray the huge costs of the French and Indian War. He thought it was going to go over so smoothly. He thought every detail was perfectly calibrated to not annoy anybody, and he was dead wrong on every last particular. He was absolutely, totally mistaken, and so were the entire British government. And also certain Americans who were over there who were asked about it at the time. Benjamin Franklin was one. What the Americans took umbrage at, and it was Patrick Henry of Virginia who first enunciated it, was the fact that the previous taxes, which had been bitterly opposed, had still been conceived as being within the Constitution. They had still been conceived to be legitimate. They were regulations of trade rather than revenue measures. Right? The stamp tax, however, could not be confused in any way. It was a revenue measure. It was a tax, a direct tax that was imposed without representation. So this was the very first time that taxation without representation was a real issue. And the American people everywhere just put their foot down and said, no, we can't have this. This is absolutely not supportable. And they were extremely upset. They felt betrayed because their protests, which had been vociferous, the Sugar Act and the acts of the writs of assistance and so forth, which were in the early 1760s, all of that, all their petitions had been completely ignored, completely dismissed, and they were really very upset to begin with. And then this stamp tax came down on top of them, and they said, no, that is the limit. As a result of the French and Indian War, you will see even today is the suggestion that the colonists had not contributed their fair share to the war effort.
Right, the war effort.
And that the war was entirely for the benefit of North America. That this was hugely expensive, hugely wasteful, and Britain doubled its national debt in 7 years. And therefore the politicians were scrambling to find a way to pay it off. And the Stamp Act was passed in February of 1765, and it sailed through, basically. It was not a big controversy in England. There were some Americans in England present at the time who said, no, this is not good, it's not going to work, but they were brushed aside. So the news got back to America in late April, early May, and the first reaction was shock, really. It was because they're still reeling from the Sugar Act. And the Currency Act is another one that's in there. Right? It's very much upsetting to everybody. So they're saying, but we sent all these petitions. We sent our commissioners to London, and nothing got heard, nothing got attended to. You know, they think so little of us. You know, people are thinking, you know, that they're just absolutely baffled. But when, in the summer of 1765, all sorts of discussion groups started to form everywhere, including New York, of course. By midsummer, it's getting very strong. There's definitely talk of what we would call today a boycott, for example, among many. But there's others who are saying, are you crazy? You're talking about defying the most powerful empire in the world, and do we really want to separate ourselves in any way from Great Britain, you know, our great protector? Well, the focus then passed really to Boston.
Okay.
Where the Boston radicals had major protests and writings and so forth, and the first overt protests happened in Boston in August. Right? There was a sort of well-managed riot on August 14th, and this was a wake-up call to the powers that were all through the colonies. And then just 2 weeks after that, there was a very disorderly riot in Boston, which burned down 3 houses, including Thomas Hutchinson's, who was the governor of Massachusetts.
Were the radicals in Boston at this point people like John Adams, Paul Revere?
Yes, and Samuel Adams and James Otis. And the New Yorkers are, of course, learning of all this, you know, a few days later. And the first call to action in New York was on September 5th when the newspaper, the town newspaper, the Weekly Postboy, the New York Gazette or Weekly Postboy, called for a funeral of Miss North American Liberty to be held on the date of the enforcement. Right?
So they were gearing up to November 1st at that point.
Yes.
All right.
This is the first call for very specific action. There obviously are people starting to organize things. There's no question that they were organized. In the middle of September, they got off a one-sheet newspaper called the Constitutional Courant. And this was so controversial that they had to print it in New Jersey because no printer in the city would print it. And they had to smuggle it into the city. And
summarize what that said?
It had some very radical statements in it, like not a call for independence, but a phrase like, if our rights as Englishmen are not going to be respected by Great Britain, why do we wish to continue the association?
So during that summer, there was a definite tension in the air, you would say, throughout the colonies.
Very much, very much. Particularly, of course, in the commercial cities. Because, among other things, the stamp tax was going to come down particularly hard on shipping. And that was the business of the commerce of the seaboard. Right?
At what point do you have any way of identifying that word specifically got back to London that there was ferment going on in the colonies, and what was the reaction there?
Everything took, at least 6 weeks all the time, right?
Right.
So the first reaction in Britain is, one, shock. They say, how could it be? This is such a nice, easy tax, right? So much less than we're paying. Right? The second is contempt and annoyance, particularly from the powers that be, the political folks. They are seeing themselves defied in all of this.
And again, the sheets of paper with that were in fact the stamps,
yeah.
were they being printed over there, or just they were expected to be printed here?
No, they were printed over there and being shipped here.
Okay.
And so one of the questions became, what do we do when those papers arrive, right? What do we do? Right?
And the time frame for the arrival was?
October.
But during this summer period, none of the stamps had arrived. When there was the ferment going on, the stamps were sort of on their way.
Right. They were printed over the summer and shipped over the summer and arrived in the fall.
Were they being shipped matter-of-factly on merchant ships, or were these being specially sent over?
They came on merchant ships.
Okay.
Right.
To the attention of the local governor?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. This is the Stamp Act Congress, right? The Stamp Act Congress was called for by Massachusetts early in June. And 9 colonies showed up here in New York City.
Wall Street and Nassau.
They were pretty ineffectual, right? First of all, they closeted themselves away.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I mean, it was powerfully symbolic, right? I mean, it was the first time there was anything like that somebody would call a Congress. What led up now from the point of the document you're talking about and the Stamp Act? I mean, what's going on? Was there any particular? Again, in that case, it was obviously there was some leadership that called for it. I mean,
yes.
where was the call in that document? The Courant, you calling it? Was the call for a Congress in that?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, actually, everybody in each colony realized, if we stick together in this, we have a better chance of defeating it. If we coordinate in any way, and these are people who are not used to coordinating with each other except commercially, and a little of that. But it was to happen in New York City. 9 colonies came forward. Everybody was impressed that something was happening, and the representatives of the other colonies were welcomed by New Yorkers and so forth. By the time the Congress dismissed, the situation had come to such a head in the city. Real shove came for New York on October 22nd, when the ship that is bearing New York stamps shows up at Sandy Hook. Right? And as soon as it got to Sandy Hook and dropped an anchor waiting
Okay.
for a pilot. Some fast
Right.
little boat is zipping into the city to tell everybody, and bang, the news is everywhere. Right? You can bet no news traveled faster than that on that day. The ship, the Edward, it was named, comes into town accompanied by 2 warships. And it's accompanied by 2 warships because Governor Colden sent a note out to the Edward, you don't want to come in here without warships. And the Navy is going to have to protect you, right? So they come in and they find 2,000 New Yorkers lined up on the shoreline. Militia types all saying, no, you're not going to land those stamps. Right? And there's a standoff, right, on the 23rd of October, right, all day. And various negotiations go back and forth in rowboats, right, between the ships that are moored right off over here, right?
What was the character of the negotiations?
We have to land the ships. Now, in addition, there's additional complications, right? This is a commercial ship. The stamp's not the only thing on it, right? There's private business that is on it, right? So it has to make a landing. It has to unload its regular commercial business, right? It can't just be sent straight back to England, which is what some of the people want, right? Take those things and go right back, right? So this is all argued all day long until nightfall, right? And at that point, the militia and the Sons of Liberty are sort of dismissed, get back at dawn, right? And the Navy pulls a fast one on them. They wake the Navy up at 2 in the morning, row the ships in and row the stamps in and stash them inside the fort.
That wasn't too bright on the Collins family. They didn't figure that out. They didn't
I
figure
don't know.
well, they wanted to go home and have dinner or something.
You know, that wasn't the thought. But, surprise.
And that's pretty accurate history. In other words,
Yeah.
yeah, the fact is, had they decided to stay there overnight with the Canadian, that would have been much more difficult to do.
Right. Somebody should have stayed there and shot off a gun or two. Governor Colden was absolutely intransigent that those stamps are going to be deployed as per the law required. Right?
Now, was he at this point? Is he having that thought or making that decision from a position of strength? I mean, were they gearing up militarily at that point?
Not in the sense of actually getting more military down here. You know, he has 200 soldiers. That's it, in a town of 20,000, and he's just sort of relying on the moral force of the idea of you can't defy the British Empire.
But from that point of view, from everything, it sounds like, once again, he was in a state of denial, right? I mean, did he seem to believe or wanted to believe he would be able to enforce the Stamp Act as proposed on the
Everybody was in opposition to the stamps. The only question among all those people was exactly how do we deal with it. We wake up the next morning, we find the stamps are secure inside the fort. Right? And this is a bit of a shock and a bit of a depression. And it was actually later that very day that suddenly the broadsides appear all over the city. This is the very short broadside of the Vox Populi, which says, "The first man that makes use of stamped paper, let him take care of his house, his person, and effects. We dare." And it's extremely threatening, right? And this is all over the city a week before the act is to take effect. So that's in the picture also, that there's this threat of violence from the opponents, the most bitter opponents of the Snap Act.
So at this point, to the British soldiers that did exist in the governor, at that point, they're sort of in denial, but did they have a plan? Had they fomented, or whoever the general or whoever in charge fomented a plan?
One of the things that they do before November 1st is that they move some of the cannons that sat on the very edge of the island, facing outward, right? Because the assumed threat would be from ships coming into the harbor to attack the island. They took some of those cannons and put them up on the ramparts of the fort, facing down at Bowling Green, right? Facing the populace, in short. This is quite a shocker, right? This is our fort putting its guns against us. So that
were they at this point, was the governor or the military dealing with any kind of what you would call instructions from England about dealing with this?
No, there were no particular instructions. They were on their own. And Colden, as I say, was very intransigent about it all.
Now, at this point, he's inside the fort with the stamps, or he's riding around?
He had taken his personal refuge into the fort. He did not normally live there.
Okay.
But
and as far as the movement of the cannons, when exactly we passed the 28th now, right? When did they get ready with the cannons?
It was the last week, at least, of October.
So we're ticking very close to November 1st at this point. Now, are the colonists
31st.
Sort of formulating their specific ideas for November 1st?
Certainly in New York. Now,
in New
York was the place where it happened. On October 31st, in the afternoon, the principal merchants of the town got together and signed a non-importation agreement. And this was a serious agreement that after January 1st, there was to be no importation of goods whatsoever from Britain until the Stamp Act was repealed. Right? Another meeting was held of your retailers and your artisans, right? And as they learned that the principal merchants, the wholesalers, had come through the agreement, they passed a similar resolution.
Were these kind of documents that were signed by the merchants?
Yeah. So that is now on the table, right? And
so by the last day of October, things were really they were hot in this city.
And in fact, there are a few rowdies that are already running around, starting to build. November 1st, there's no commerce. It's a Friday, right? There's no business taking place because they don't know what to do, right? Incidentally, all the businessmen have looked on November 1st as their deadline, right? On October 31st is their deadline for months. So they've been trying to pack all a year's worth of business into this 5 months, right? And all the ships are out because they know that after November 1st, it's going to be a real problem to ship anything. Right? So basically, all the ships are gone. They've been rushed out. And that means an awful lot of mariners are sitting idle on the docks. Right? A lot of businesses are laying people off. So
good material for a riot.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
A little bit of beverage to add that on to.
So the protest rolls around for the evening of November 1st, right, which starts down here somewhere on the docks. With there's sort of two parades that there's a smaller one that goes around and then merges with a larger one that happens well into the evening up at what is now City Hall Park.
Okay.
Right? The first parade, I think, has a sort of satiric aspect to it. I think they had an effigy of Colden. Right? Effigies were major thing in those days. I think I imagine them having him sitting on a rail, right? They're carrying. So they parade this around. They go up to Wall Street. They go in front of the Merchants Coffee House. Merchants applaud. They go over to Broad Street, and they're in front of City Hall there, right? And everybody sort of basically thumbs their noses at the mayor, and they proceed right on their way. They go down for the first time to Bowling Green, and they're parading this thing in front of the fort where they know Colden is holed up. And they have the idea, I presume it's premeditated, of attacking the carriage house which is outside the fort, where Colden's carriage is located, a garage basically. Right? Now, of course, a carriage is a major symbol in those days, right? It's like a Mercedes or a Rolls Royce today, like very fancy. And they had painted crests on the side and so forth. So they broke into this garage and they stole the carriage. They brought it out. And this met wild approbation from all the people who were following along, right? These were normally property-respecting folks. Their slogan was liberty, property, and no stamps, right? But Colden was so hated, and they figured he was after their property, after all, So this is a little tit for tat here. Then they take the carriage, and this is probably man-hauled, right? And they head up Broadway, the fields, right, the commons. And there the funeral of liberty is to begin. There were funerals in other cities also. Several other cities had funerals of liberty on November the 1st. So I presume it was a full dress affair, right? That they had a bier, a catafalque, horse-drawn hearse, right? They had church bells tolling and so forth, people wearing black, the whole 9 yards. Funerals were a huge deal in the late colonial period, just great big elaborate affairs. Okay. So this is all now under torchlight and candlelight. Some 2,000 people have now accumulated, and they walk back down Broadway to the fort. They've grown from a couple hundred to 2,000, you see.
Yeah, that's a sizable crowd.
Right. This is 1/10 of the population. Right? So now, at this point, you see, they really realize that there could be a confrontation.
Now, when they're getting back to Bowling Green, they both have the carriage with them and the effigy?
Yes.
And you think they have a coffin?
And they have a coffin, and they have 2,000 people. They have the torches flaring. Now, there's torches on top of the fort also.
That's right. And
you can see the soldiers up there, and you can see the cannon that are pointed down at the people in Bowling Green. Right?
What would you guess, if you had to guess, what time of evening this part is taking place?
I think this is after 7 o'clock.
Okay.
I think this is, and remember, it's November 1st.
Yeah, it's dark.
Right, so it's dark early. if there's no report of it being rained on or anything, but at best it would be a little chilly.
Now, do we assume? I mean, your assumption this was a shouting type of a mob, hurling insults,
yes.
or would
there would certainly be drums, and you
drums?
see, remember,
drums,
you're thinking
drums,
funeral.
drums.
This is a funeral.
Yeah, drums. I like
right?
the drums.
Right.
Drums.
Drums and the church bells. They get back down here, and some go up to the fort and start banging on the door, right? They want admittance because the real object, what they want, is to get those stamps and to get them under control in some way, out of the control of the governor. Right? They know that there's only 200 soldiers in there, but those 200 soldiers could do a whacking lot of damage, right? But there are rowdies in the crowd who are drunk as skunks, of course, and some of them start literally attacking the fort. A few ladders are thrown up against the walls, right? And these are simply pushed aside. The soldiers do not basically respond. This speaks to the control of the soldiers because there's massive provocation. That there were hundreds of people, soldiers, sailors, and carpenters with all kinds of tools ready to dismantle the doors.
Is your view of the consensus was that this mob was ready to do some serious damage if they had the opportunity?
Certain members of it. You see, I think there was quite a spectrum within the crowd, within the 2,000, right? Certainly the leaders that we would call the Sons of Liberty did not want a major confrontation here. They didn't see any point in it. They thought it might redound against them.
And was it the same mindset in reverse inside the fort?
Yes. Yeah, there was something of the same. All sorts of things are going on. Colden is very adamant.
In charge inside the fort, or is there a key officer who would be?
There's a key officer, right, that Colden cannot directly order.
Okay.
Although he can certainly put up a fuss. So the Sons of Liberty, or the leadership there, realizes that things are just starting to get out of hand and this is going a little bit too far. And what they do, I think it was pre-planned, right, is they create a bonfire in Bowling Green. Right? And this pulls people back from the edge of the fort. Right? And still, everybody's still wondering, are they ever going to shoot those cannon off? Right? But this makes it a little bit less likely. They burn the effigies, they throw on the carriage, right?
All right.
They find 2 sleighs that were also owned by the governor. Right, they throw those on, they throw the gallows in, right? Right. They have a dandy bonfire.
Oh, I love it.
And so at least an hour is passing at this, and people are starting to melt away. But there's some crazies around, right? And one of these folks says, Major James must be made to pay for his arrogance, right? And everybody follow me, right? Nobody knows who this individual is, right? Now, it happens that Major James is the man who said he was going to cram the stamps down their throats with his sword, right? He was also the artillery manager of the fort. He was the man who did not fire, right? But he had just built up a major refurbishment to a house on Ranelagh Gardens, right? And that was the house that was attacked that night by this rump organization, that just ran away from Bowling Green uptown to what is now Greenwich and Chambers, right? Where Ranelagh Gardens was, where this house was. And they didn't torch the house. They had that much sense in a town built of wood, not to torch it, but they ransacked it. They left the walls standing, and that was about it. So everybody woke up on November the 2nd. It had not been serious bloodshed, which everybody was grateful for. There was actually nobody died on November 1st. But it was the biggest riot that New York had ever seen. And there were very serious calls now. Let's attack the fort on November 5th. So this, all kinds of negotiations and everybody being absolutely on tenterhooks continues for 4 days right up to November 5th. And in the middle of November 5th, Colden communicates with General Gage, right, who is actually in the city, not living inside the fort, and says, I want an okay from you to surrender, basically, to surrender the stamps. Right? I want you to say that my hand was forced. Right? Now, why does Gage do this? What I realize is that Gage's hand was also forced because the Army had a huge stash of ammunition and materiel sitting out in East River warehouses, unprotected. All the military folks were inside the fort, protecting the fort, but that materiel was available for the grabbing, and certainly the populace of New York knew where it was. Right? So Gage realizes he can't get any reinforcements here in time. If he doesn't give Colden an okay to surrender the stamps, then all hell might break loose. So Colden surrenders the stamps to the city corporation on the afternoon of November 5th, end of major crisis. Right? There's 7 carts pull out from the fort, and they go up Broadway, they turn right down Wall Street, and the 7 carts are packed into City Hall and locked up. Right? And the city signs for them. Right? The city council had to agree to indemnify the value of the stamps, right, to Colden. That was a little stipulation. And of course the city fathers wanted to do that because they did not want a riot. Right? They did not want the city to burn down or anything. February of 1766, exactly a year after they passed the Stamp Act, they realized they have to undo it. How do they undo it with a keeping face, right? And what they do is they pass something called the Declaratory Act, right? And the Declaratory Act insisted that Parliament had the right to pass laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, meaning including taxes. So they pass this Declaratory Act, and then they repeal the stamp tax. Huge rejoicings around England, right? Because it's obvious that this is part of the economic depression that's going on in England. It takes another 2-3 months to get the news to America. In fact, it's May when it gets to New York, and the town goes berserk with joy. Right? And there are a few nervous folks, radical thinkers, who say, This declaratory act is bad, bad, bad news. Don't get too excited about the fact that they've taken that stamp tax away. There are a few of them who actually say we should continue the boycott, right, until it's all gone. But not a chance, right? So everything calms down completely for 2 years, and the rest, you know, is history.
Yep.